Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today so we don't take up too much of your time and we can get through all the fabulous speakers that we have. And folks can just trickle in as they can. Feel free to use the chat to interact with other folks here. Introduce yourself, let us know your pronouns, where you're calling from, what makes you so interested in this topic, where you're working, anything. And thank you all for joining us today in this really crucial conversation. Some of us bright and early and some of us late at night. So we really appreciate everyone just making some time to be here. And if you've been following along our series from last year, you'll know this is our third and final installment in our webinar series, Confronting Harmful Gender-Based Practices Occurring in the United States. And we're talking today about child and forced marriage. And also, while we're all speaking today, be sure to drop your questions in the chat because we'll have a brief Q&A at the end of the webinar. You can go to the next slide. So I'll dive right in. A couple years back, a colleague of mine, Amani Nelson, who could not be with us today because she is now in the Peace Corps doing some cool stuff, but she and I wrote a report called Behind Closed Doors, Exposing and Addressing Harmful Gender-Based Practices in the United States, confronting a few different harmful gender-based practices that are often written off as foreign concepts only. There are things that we in the United States don't really want to confront as happening right here at home. So this includes female genital mutilation and cutting, femicide, virginity testing, and child and forced marriage, of course. You can go to the next slide. So we put forth that there's this idea of resistance to recognizing harmful gender-based practices, and this stems in part from American exceptionalism, or this idea that America is morally superior to the rest of the world. And this really, really inhibits progress in this area. Because in order to move towards sustainable change, we need to first recognize the harm happening. And recognizing the harm and fostering global awareness, building alliance across communities, cultures, and borders, cultivating cultural humility are all crucial for dismantling oppressive structures and advocating for positive change. So, unless we recognize the universal dimensions of gender-based harms, we cannot show solidarity against the gender-based violence happening across the globe and here. So the fact of the matter is that gender-based violence and these harmful gender-based practices are universal, and people of all communities and cultures are impacted, and yes, even in the United States, to Americans. And go to the next slide. So, of course, child marriage and forced marriage is no different. And I'll take us just a step back to quickly define what child marriage is, or an acronym that you might see a lot in this field, CEFMU, which stands for Child Early Forced Marriage and Unions. And this can be defined as any formal marriage or informal union involving at least one party under the age of 18 or without the full and free consent of one or both parties. And just so we are clear, this is a life-threatening human rights violation, and it does have long-term consequences, not only for the individuals in the child marriage, but also for the broader community as well. Next slide. So some of the harmful impacts can include increased maternal mortality and morbidity and increased childbirth complications. This is partially because child and early marriage can often lead to early pregnancy, sometimes unwanted, which is met with greater risk in childbirth. There's also often an imbalanced power dynamic between specifically child brides and their partners, as child marriages often occur between a girl under 18 and an older man, and this can lead to a higher risk of intimate partner violence, marital rape, and reproductive coercion. This can also relate to decreased opportunity for girls married young. By opportunity, I mean like economic and educational opportunity. For example, some married girls drop out of school early and are met with decreased economic opportunities afterwards. And this can lead to intergenerational poverty. And many women who were married as children also suffer from depression and other mental health disorders. Next slide. Yet, unfortunately, child marriage does prevail. Approximately 1 in 5 girls are married during childhood across the globe, but in the United States specifically, an estimated 300,000 minors were married between 2000 and 2018, despite an increase in legal reforms across the states in the past few years. And this in general is just something people don't know about. Many people don't realize that child marriage is legal in a lot of states in the United States. So, a majority of these marriages were between girls ages 16 to 17 and an adult man. And between 2000 and 2015, 86% of reported child marriages took place between minors and adults. And COVID-19 also is associated with an uptick of child marriages. The exact number in the US is unclear, but it is predicted that up to 10 million more girls are at risk of becoming child brides since the pandemic. Reasons for child marriage persisting are highly complex and varies, ranging from economic concerns, harmful norms, and family agreements. Knowledge of the specific social factors that perpetuate child marriage in the United States is also extremely limited. So that's a huge gap in the research in this field. In some cases, unintended pregnancy has been cited as a reason to be married as a child, but this has not been found as a key motivator. Religion has also been found to be a key driver, with child marriage found in deeply religious communities in the United States, such as the evangelical community or Orthodox communities. But in general, the entrenched patriarchal systems that value girls' virginity can lead to child marriage, where marriage is seen to elevate a girl or protect family honor. Next slide. So I'm not going to talk too much about this because we have some awesome policy experts that will dive more into this, but child marriage is currently legal in 34 states, and 4 states do not require any minimum age for marriage with a parental or judicial waiver. These are common exceptions to for child marriage occurring, which allows marriage to occur either with parental consent or approval from court judges. There are also loopholes in federal law that allow child marriage to persist. For example, immigration law does not specify a minimum age to petition a foreign spouse or fiance. So between 2007 and 2017, the US government approved nearly 9,000 marriage-based petitions involving minors as either the beneficiary or petitioner. There has been a lot of progress, though. There's a lot of states that are banning child marriage, and there's a lot of awesome people working on that. The Violence Against Women Act reauthorization in 2022 removed marriage as a defense for federal statutory rape charges. So prior to this, there were 14 states that violated statutory rape laws with their child marriage laws because of the blurred legality, but this was corrected with that. But in general, just the patchwork of laws across the United States allow for child marriage to persist. You can go to the next slide. So this map is outdated. It's from November 2023, but it's just showing the range of child marriage laws across the state. So it just is highly, highly varied. Something that surprises a lot of folks is how California has no age floor for child marriage, and they also have a pretty poor record for keeping track. So that's something there's a major focus on. You can go to the next slide. So while the United States is a major player in promoting policies overseas to prevent child marriage, the laws within the country are weak in protecting vulnerable minors because of just the patchwork of laws. A comprehensive approach that combines legal reforms, community-based support services, and raising awareness through education is essential to protect the rights and well-being of minors and prevent the perpetuation of the harmful practice. So advocacy in this field should focus on raising the minimum age of marriage, expanding access to education and support services for youth and survivors, and strengthening support from other gender research fields. For example, when it comes to awareness building, a huge part of it is strengthening collaboration between the sexual and reproductive health field and child marriage. And our unified goal in protecting bodily autonomy. So while young people should be allowed to make decisions that concern their future, such as accessing sexual and reproductive health resources and services, they should not be trapped in legal contracts that they do not have the power to end, such as with child marriage. So strengthening collaboration between these fields is crucial for advocating for the laws we need, which is encouraging states to adopt strong laws that sets minimum age of marriage to 18 so we can close those loopholes that allow child marriage to persist here. Finally, investing in the community, investing in youth-led organizations with peer-to-peer approaches, to expanding education and integration of comprehensive sexuality education in our schools. Enhancing girls' education is crucial to improving quality of health education and youth empowerment, and recognizing like gender discrimination and what child marriage is. And also just investing in survivors, expanding tertiary care resources such as domestic violence shelters and the civil legal protections that folks can seek out. Um, Next slide, please. And always important that we like to always focus on when speaking on gender-based violence is just acknowledging the disproportionate harm that happens against the LGBTQI plus community. The gender-based harms against this community are often greater in magnitude, but also need to be approached differently because they have different specific needs. For example, in the case of child marriage, there are reported cases of individuals sometimes being forced into heterosexual marriage through physical or emotional pressure. However, there is still very limited research on the specific needs of this community, but I want to just acknowledge that separately. Next slide. Okay, and so this is when I get off the mic and I want to pass it on to some very informed and empowering trailblazers in the field, starting with Donna Simmons, who I'll let Casey introduce.
Thanks, Maniza. I will not take up a lot of time, but it is an absolute joy to introduce folks to longtime survivor advocate, now also author, founder of a nonprofit herself, and champion of legislation, Donna Simmons. She has been working on this issue from a lived expertise position for longer, probably than Tahirih has. And that's something important to acknowledge, that a lot of survivors have been advocating for change long before nonprofits and others were stepping into this space. So we have a lot to learn from Donna, and I'm really excited to hand the mic over to her and hear what you have to share with us today, Donna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Casey. And it has truly been a pleasure to work with you and Tahirih on this issue over the years. Good morning, everyone. My name is Donna Simmons, and I would like to start off by thanking you for your participation in our webinar today as we tackle the uncomfortable topic of child marriage in America. I am speaking before you today from my home state of Kentucky as the founder of the Rise Kentucky Coalition, Reclaiming Innocence and Stopping Exploitation. Now, my connection to this work is deeply personal, as I am a survivor of child marriage, sexual exploitation, and domestic violence. But before I begin sharing my lived experience with you, I would like to take a moment and orient you to the problematic nature of child marriage in Kentucky specifically, and what we've done so far to address it. And we can move to the next slide, please. So between the years of 2000 and 2015, more than 10,000 child marriages were recorded in my home state of Kentucky. So just let that number sit with you for a moment. A 13-year-old girl was included in that population, pregnant and married off to a 33-year-old man. A 15-year-old girl, also pregnant, was married to a 52-year-old man. And there was no minimum age required in Kentucky at that time that we pulled this research. There was no mandated evaluation for predatory abuse. And if a girl was 16 or older, all it took was parental consent, no questions asked. If she was younger than 16, pregnancy was enough to grant permission through judicial approval. This is how the system handed girls over to abusers legally, literally giving predators a license to continue offending. But that damage doesn't stop at legality. Children who marry early are significantly more likely to drop out of school, live in poverty, experience domestic violence without the means to escape, and face serious health and mental health challenges, as Manisa has shared with you previously. Studies have also shown that early marriage is strongly correlated with high adverse childhood experience scores, meaning that these individuals are already likely to have endured significant trauma through abuse, neglect, or instability. And when we allow these child marriages to occur, we're not protecting the children. We are compounding their trauma. And unfortunately, I know this kind of trauma firsthand. So I can share with you from a personal experience perspective that when you hear studies have shown that intimate partner violence played a role in 26% of suicide cases where circumstances were known, it's not only believable, but also likely underestimated. And additionally, when you consider that girls married as minors are 50% more likely to experience intimate partner violence than those who marry after adulthood, the fact that suicidality is twice as common for child marriage survivors is not shocking. But what is shocking is that child marriage still occurs in America, including in my home state of Kentucky. And as we transition to the next slide, you will see that back in 2018, we fought to change this, and Kentucky did take a historic step to offer additional protections to children from exploitation through child marriage. Senate Bill 48 passed in 2018 with new protective requirements. As we said, no one under the age of 17 should be able to marry. And for those 17-year-olds, the age gap must not exceed 4 years. And proof of self-sufficiency should be required to legally protect against entrapment. That 17-year-old would have to appear before a judge for judicial oversight and protection of the minor from predatory situations. And although it was not the state that we wanted it to land at, of that age 18 bright line, that progress was a massive win. And we told the nation at that time, Kentucky will lead in protecting its most vulnerable. But laws are only as strong as the people who uphold them. And today I'm here to tell you, some are not. And on the next slide, you'll be able to see that since Senate Bill 48 took effect, Kentucky has experienced a dramatic decrease in the number of child marriage cases, yes. But we also now have evidence that in Kentucky, 6 16-year-olds have been married in violation of state law. We have records showing 2 17-year-olds married to adults ages 27 and 29. Relationships that, under Kentucky statute, those minors could not legally consent to. And this is not just a technical violation. This is the betrayal of a promise to our children. And when we asked for the county by county data to see where these unlawful marriages occurred, we were told no. Not because the information was personal, it wasn't. Not because it doesn't exist, it does. But because we were told the public cannot know. Closing the door to public data does not protect children. It protects those who break the law. Now, despite the Office of Vital Statistics' initial refusal to provide this information, we were able to get very limited data from a trusted and reputable source that did identify some of the non-compliant counties. And between this and my escalation to our governor's office, the Office of Vital Statistics did end up conceding, and they provided us with the county identifying information. And I have turned that over to our state attorney general's office for investigation. However, The Office of Vital Statistics' initial refusal demonstrates that without public demand for accountability and ultimately for reform, true, meaningful reform, this state office prioritizes protection of officials violating and ignoring the law over the protection of children. Let me be real clear here. Survivors, such as myself, have had to spend our lives fighting to survive the abuse, fighting to not become a statistic, fighting to be taken seriously about our capabilities when the world at large seems structured to reject us and keep us down. Isn't that enough fighting? We should not have to continue fighting, just downright begging systems and government to do the right thing. Transparency is not the enemy. Transparency is the guardian of justice. And without it, the law is a paper tiger. Impressive on paper, powerless in practice. And as survivors, we know silence and secrecy are the best friends of abuse. And moving to the next slide. When our systems fail to protect children, we are not just talking about broken rules. We are talking about broken lives. A 16-year-old forced into marriage loses more than their youth. They lose safety. They lose education. They lose the very choices that adulthood was supposed to give them, the very choices that they could have otherwise made to escape the cycles of abuse that they were entrapped in. And for me, well, my story begins with my first memory. And it isn't a memory of toys or laughter. It's of chaos. My mother faking a heart attack to get her way. I grew up learning that love was conditional and that silence was survival and that my worth was measured by what I could endure. And by 13, I wasn't a child anymore, not in the ways that mattered. At 14, I was sent to a psychiatric institution and labeled as broken. And that is where the grooming began. The man who was supposed to help me heal, working in this facility as a mental health technician, saw my pain as opportunity. And he taught me what every predator teaches, that I was small, that I was dependent, that I was his to own. And at 16, he made that ownership legal. I became a child bride in America at 16 years old to a 31-year-old man. And, people ask me what that felt like. Here's the truth. It felt like a prison without bars. It felt like screaming in a language no one spoke. And when I finally escaped, the system did not save me. It caged me differently. I couldn't go to a domestic violence shelter because I wasn't 18. I could not rent my own apartment because I couldn't sign a lease. I could not consent to my own medical care, but the law said I could be married to a grown man. And when I had a child, do you know what the judge did? He handed my abuser custody and ordered me to pay him child support. The law did not just fail me, it protected him. I was homeless at one point. I was working in a strip club to survive. I was trying to mother through supervised visits while navigating a system that clearly had been designed to break me. And yet I refused to stay silent because survival was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a revolution. Because what do I do when my education, my body, my income, my child were taken away from me and handed over to the man who groomed, abused, and exploited me? Well, I organized a coalition, and I stand up to the systems and officials that allow this to take place and demand better. Better for everyone still struggling in violent situations who feel hopeless. Better for those growing up in these harsh and scary environments. And better for those who have not even been born yet. Because children deserve to grow up knowing safety and not having to spend decades recovering from their early years like I have. Next slide, please. As you can see from my presentation today, we are in need of support from across Kentucky, from across America, to say we will no longer turn a blind eye to children paying the price for bad, and in this case, downright illegal decisions that adults make. I call on every Kentuckian, every American to stand with us because protecting our children is not optional. It's our duty. If you feel moved by today's announcement, that's your sign to join us in this upcoming session. Visit traumatopurpose.com to get involved in our efforts. Read my memoir, Ashes to Flame, and share it with a survivor who needs to feel seen and hopeful that healing is possible. Listen to my podcast, The Last Generation, and share this with others to keep this conversation alive. You know, I wrote Ashes to Flame because I believe this. Your past is not a life sentence. It is the birthplace of your purpose. And today, I continue to fight to end child marriage in the United States because no child should endure what I did. No child should be forced to call their rapist husband. No child should lose custody of their baby to their abuser. And no child should be told this is the best you can hope for. So when you hear my story, don't just feel something. Do something. Join me in changing these laws, breaking these cycles, and building a future children don't spend decades of their lives trying to recover from. Because if I've learned anything, it's this. Silence is the most dangerous part of abuse. But healing is the loudest rebellion there is, and that is how cycles break. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna, for not only sharing your empowering testimony, but also the work that you're currently doing, recognizing that it's not just about changing the laws, but it's also about holding lawmakers and our counties accountable to the laws and supporting survivors in their healing and those at risk. These are all incredibly important tenets of approaching this issue. I am currently reading your book. I encourage everyone else to check it out. I think Melina dropped a link in the chat if you are interested. But really, really appreciate you and learning from all that you have to say. And I now want to pass on the mic to Anjali Sui. She first broke the story on child marriage occurring within the United States with Frontline PBS back in 2017, and now is an independent and investigative journalist. And her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Frontline PBS, of course, ProPublica, among other publications. So we got kind of the advocacy perspective from Donna, and now a research perspective from Anjali. So take it away.
Thank you for the kind introduction. And Donna, that was very, very powerful to hear your own personal story. Thank you for sharing. So up here on the screen is a picture of my maternal grandparents, and they had an arranged marriage in 1940s in India, back when my grandmother, who's still around, actually she just turned 88, was a minor. And so I had always known that this was part of my family's history. And at the time, that was very common practice in India to have arranged marriages. But fast forward to, and my grandparents ultimately were married for over 50 years until my grandfather's passing. When I thought about child marriage for most of my life, I thought of that as, something in the distant past, maybe something that would happen, outside of the US. I held those sort of preconceived notions. And if we go to the next slide, in 2015, when I was a graduate student studying journalism at Columbia, I read this op-ed in the New York Times, as many of you all in this room may have at the time. It was written by Frady Reese, the executive director of Unchained at Last. And at the time, Frady, who is a survivor of forced marriage herself in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, actually went to the health departments in New York and New Jersey, and she gathered data that showed that almost 4,000 children under the age of 18 were married between 2000 and 2010 in New York State, and a similar number under the age of 18 married in New Jersey between 1995 and 2012. At the time, Frady wrote about how every single state in the US allowed for marriages to take place between involving people under the age of 18. And so I was really kind of fascinated by this statistic. It kind of blew my mind. And as a graduate student at the time, I was trying to come up with a project that I could do that would have a national scope. So fast forward a couple of years, I was at Frontline PBS as a reporting fellow there. And what I did was me and my team, we built on the data that Unchained at last had gathered in these 2 states and some many other states. And we filed records requests and got, for the first time, a fuller picture of exactly how many people were being married in the US before the age of 18. So in total, we gathered data for around 43 states. The next slide, please. And we published a data visualization. And for the first time, we were able to get a complete picture. So we can kind of go through the next few slides kind of quickly. So at the time, we found out that more than 200,000 minors were married in the United States over the course of 15 years. And although fewer minors were getting married compared to the year 2000, the practice was still persisting. Obviously, these numbers are a little bit out of date, but it was the first time we were able to kind of piece this together. As others have mentioned, most of the minors who married were girls. Next slide, please. And then the next one. And the minors who married other minors versus adults. So in most cases, they were girls marrying adult men. And next slide, please. And interestingly, the data that we got also showed us the age of the other partner, in most cases men. So we had girls marrying men in their 40s, 50s, and up to 60 plus. So in Idaho, we came across a case of a 17-year-old girl married to a 65-year-old man. And one of the oldest people we found in our data set was a 74-year-old in Alabama, and his bride was 14. Next slide, please. And so this map here shows us the rate of child marriage at the time. This is going back to 2010. It's interesting to see the dark blue are the states where there are the highest rates of child marriage. In the next slide. And we built this tool that enables anyone to kind of go up and search their state so you can have a better understanding of what the data looks like in your state. You'd see Kentucky ranks pretty high. So one thing that I wanted to do as a journalist understanding this issue in this day and age is to actually talk to and connect with people who in 2015, 2016 were going ahead with this and getting married before the age of 18. And I encountered a lot of survivors who had married decades ago, but it was actually very challenging to talk to someone who had gone through this more recently. But I eventually connected with the family. And so in the summer of 9th grade, Heather found out that she was pregnant. She was only 14 at the time. and her boyfriend, Aaron, was 24. And the two of them had met in this shop in Idaho, not too far from Yellowstone National Park. And Heather's family owned and operated the little store, and Aaron was working there with his parents over the summer break. And in Idaho, where they met, it's actually considered statutory rape for an adult to have sex with anyone under the age of 16. And the maximum punishment is quite harsh. It could be up to life in prison, and it's considered a felony. And in order to get married at the time in Idaho at the age of 15, Heather would have needed permission from a parent as well as permission from a judge. And what happened is that Heather's parents were divorced and her mother lived out of state. And the mother actually kind of, when she heard that Heather was pregnant and possibly considering marriage, she called the police and had them look into the case. And so all this added a real sense of urgency. And Heather and her family members sat down and decided to have a family meeting. And Heather's father, Keith, at the time thought that marriage was what the Bible advised. And they also hoped that it would keep Aaron out of trouble. Marriage, they reasoned, would help to legitimize their relationship and allow them to raise a baby together. And so the grandmother, who's the matriarch of the family, she went online and starts like searching, where there are more lenient laws that would allow them to get married. And eventually they landed on Missouri. At the time, Missouri only required signature from one custodial guardian or a parent. And so on Heather's 15th birthday, the family packed up the car and drove 17 hours, and Heather and Aaron were married in Missouri. And the reason I came across their story and got a chance to connect with her, next slide, please, is that this case actually ended up in the local news, and it ended up intersecting with law enforcement, which is pretty rare. But it kind of offered a window of opportunity to understand, how one family dealt with this unexpected pregnancy and this kind of huge age gap in the relationship between Heather and Aaron. So what happened in the end in this case was that the marriage was very short-lived. Heather's mom, when she found out that her daughter had gotten married, was really unhappy and filed a police report. And the police in Idaho actually took action, and Aaron was charged with statutory rape and eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison. And Heather's father was also arrested and charged with 2 counts of injury to a child and 1 count of accessory to rape. And he was sentenced to 4 months in jail. I think looking back on everything that unfolded, Keith spoke with a sense of regret. He said, "I love my daughter very much, and never would I want to do anything to intentionally harm her. Looking back on the situation and what transpired, I realized that it was the wrong decision." So I think that this case, gives us a lot to think about, and it's just one case in one case out of many out there. But it does kind of illustrate how the patchwork of laws in the US kind of gives rise to all these opportunities for people to cross state lines, and also kind of the complex nature of the decisions that families are grappling with, and how it also ultimately harms the minors in this situation. So I just have one final slide that we could flip to. So you can see, actually, we were able to get the marriage certificate and license application there. So you can see clearly at the time, Aaron 24, Heather 15.
Thank you so much, Anjali, for sharing. Your reporting really is like continues to be cited and was really helpful in the field for just having a number to refer to at all, because that accountability is incredibly important and something that was hard to do. And I really appreciate the case studies or cases that you've shared because it's not just about the numbers but also the stories behind them. And I think you indicate an important gap in the research too of understanding the motivations behind child marriage and how exactly we can hone in on those. But without
Thank you.
for yeah, well, thank you so much. Yeah, but without further ado, I would like to welcome our colleagues from Tahirih Justice Center, who are also our co-sponsors today for this webinar. And I think Tahirih is really a role model in this field in advocating against child and forced marriage. They have a ton of material that's incredibly helpful for me as a researcher. So today we have Casey Swegman, who is a nationally recognized expert on the issues of forced and child marriage in the United States. And as the Director of Public Policy at Tahirih Justice Center, she oversees the Forced Marriage Initiative, which provides direct services to survivors nationally. She also chairs the National Forced Marriage Working Group, which is comprised of experts, advocates, including survivors across the country committed to contributing deeply to efforts to address the problem of forced marriage in the United States through community level engagement, transformation, and prevention, as well as direct services and federal and state-based policy solutions. We also have Alex Goyette, who is a public policy manager at Tahirih Justice Center. Alex coordinates with Tahirih's state level legislative advocacy and supports both Tahirih staff and partners who engage with state legislatures in pursuit of Tahirih's policy goals. He's an expert on child marriage legislation and works closely with the Forced Marriage Initiative as well, and leads their campaign to end child marriage in the United States.
Thank you so much. And I think if we can go to the next slide, I will just start by saying a huge thank you to Donna again for being here with us and sharing your personal story. We know it's never easy, no matter how many times you tell it. And hearing from you today is, I hope, going to inspire lots of people to take action and get involved. And I'm so glad that you were able to be a part of this. And Anjali, I actually did not know that about your grandparents, and I'm also likewise very grateful for your willingness to share that and hold the complexity of this topic while also being an expert on it. So thank you for that. We can go to the next slide, and I'll just give a very brief overview of the Tahirih Justice Center. We are a national nonprofit with 5 local offices across the United States, providing direct legal and social services to immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. And those offices are in Baltimore, Maryland, Falls Church, Virginia, Atlanta, Georgia, Houston, Texas, and the San Francisco Bay Area. And Tahirih has been around since 1997, providing free immigration legal services to survivors of gender-based violence, often seeking asylum in the United States after fleeing female genital mutilation, the threat of forced and child marriage, as well as trafficking victims and survivors of other crime, and VAWA self-petitioners who are foreign-born women and girls married to abusive United States spouses. So there is a clear intersection between all that work Tahirih had already been doing since the late 90s to 2011, when we started to receive an increase in calls from US citizens and legal permanent residents and recently arrived refugees who have status in the United States, and do not need an immigration attorney as such because of that status, but we're facing the threat of forced marriage, the threat of forced child marriage in the same way many of our other clients had experienced abroad. And so at that time, there was really a gap in services and understanding. And we worked with the other members of the National Forced Marriage Working Group to sort of conceive of what then became the Forced Marriage Initiative, which has now been providing direct services and then parlaying what we're learning from the survivors we work with into policy proposals to better protect and prevent individuals in the United States from facing the threat of forced marriage and the harms of forced child marriage. So the Forced Marriage Initiative work has been around since 2011, but Tahirih has been around since the late 90s. And I think while this webinar is really hyper-focused, as it should be, on the issues of forced and child marriage, I think, as Maniza recognized, the importance of acknowledging the disproportionate impact and the unique traumas and harms that the LGBTQIA plus community experiences when they go through this kind of trauma. It's also really critical now to acknowledge the compounded threats and oppression and really the chilling effect that our current political environment is having on immigrant survivors. And whether that's a first generation immigrant survivor or someone who's been here many, many years, the impact is the same. Immigrant survivors and those feeling under threat of abuse from spouses or other members of their family are feeling right now very afraid of reaching out for help. For fear that the threat of deportation looms larger than the threat of abuse that they are facing. So I would be remiss as an organization specifically focused on immigrant survivors in this moment, not to name that immigrant survivors and immigrant women and girls who are at risk are really struggling to get help and get services above and beyond what we already know those under threat of child marriage often face, and what Donna iterated in her personal story. So I hope we can all take that forward and incorporate an understanding of that intersectional oppression that immigrant survivors are experiencing right now into how we talk about issues and how we provide services and fund service providers to do this work in an incredibly challenging environment in many instances now. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Alex Goyette, who at this point is far more connected to our state legislative advocacy work than I am and is the best person to speak to it. So Alex, I'll turn it over to you and we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Casey, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm going to give an overview of the legal landscape across the United States as it relates to the issue of forced child marriages. We can advance the slide. So again, just a quick overview here, and I actually saw Beckett in the chat that you all have a new report out that has updated these numbers, and so I'll verbally do that now. Between 2000 and I think you said 2021, there were more like 315,000 children married across the United States. And while we don't know the individual situations that each of these children are in, we do know from the data that we've gathered across the US, as well as from the way that these laws are constructed, that these cases involve a lot of concerning factors that point to likely coercion in these situations. For one thing, the vast majority of these cases across the United States and in every individual state where we've looked, the two people getting married are not two minors. They're not two high schoolers who are deeply in love and want to get married before graduation. The reality is that these are typically adult men marrying minor girls. And in many of these cases, as Anjali touched on in her reporting, the adults in these cases are not just a couple years older, but their years are even decades older than the child that they're marrying. The way that laws across the United States are constructed also undermine the ability of a minor to say no to an unwanted marriage. One way that this is done is the most typical exception to minimum marriage ages is for parental permission. And you can kind of get in the head of a lawmaker originally writing this down. You can see where they're coming from. Parents, we like to think, are, typically have the best interest of their child in mind. But what we at Tahirih know from our years of case work on children who are facing forced marriage is that the parents are the most typical perpetrators of a forced child marriage. And so what these laws, while perhaps well-meaning originally, are in effect doing is empowering the perpetrator of violence in this situation rather than protecting the survivor. And we can advance the slide. So there are a lot of challenges to working on the issue of forced marriage generally, and particularly forced child marriage in the US. And one of those is just the simple division of authority between what the federal government can do and what state governments can do. And when it comes to this issue, most of the laws impacting the day-to-day experience of a survivor are handled by state governments. And what that means is that as you travel across the United States and go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, the laws change. Um, and so that makes both casework and policy work much more complicated. As many of you on the call know, we're in the midst of an ongoing effort to change the laws in not just 50 states, but also DC and US territories. And so that means running dozens of different campaigns instead of just trying to pass one law federally. And so that means this is really a protracted effort that a lot of folks are involved in trying to get every single state in the US to update their laws, because until every single state has banned child marriage, no child in the US is safe from child marriage. It is, as you all know, really easy to drive across state lines in the US. There's no travel limitations within the United States. And so just because you live in a state, say New York, that has banned child marriage doesn't mean you can't drive across state lines into a state that has not and be married there. Laws across the United States are also typically written to preference parents' rights. This, again, is well-meaning and in most situations probably makes sense. Parents, again, are typically going to have the best interest of their child in mind, but it becomes a problem, once again, when we are specifically talking about a forced child marriage where the parent is the perpetrator of that violence. When the laws we have on the books and the systems we have in place to safeguard children are used to deferring to the parents, that can be really dangerous when the parent is, in fact, the perpetrator of violence. Systems are also typically not set up to deal with forced marriage as a specific type of gender-based violence because of ways that it differs from other forms of violence. One important way that forced marriage is different from things like domestic violence or sexual assault is that the person facing a forced marriage knows that a future harm is coming. There may be even a date circled on the calendar for their wedding day. And while forced marriage is in and of itself a form of violence, it also intersects with all of these other forms of gendered violence, including sexual assault. So while they may have not already experienced violence, they know those harms are coming. They know I am going to be married. That marriage is probably going to involve things like non-consensual sex. It may involve domestic violence within that relationship. There may be ongoing violence with their family if their parents are the ones coercing them into the marriage. That may be ongoing as well. But the systems we have in place to provide protections to survivors of violence are typically more retrospective. When you're doing something like looking for a protection order or restraining order, often what you have to talk about is violence that you have already experienced. And so that makes it difficult for someone who perhaps has not already faced physical violence to say, I haven't experienced this violence yet, but I know it is coming, and I know that I will need protection. Many of the systems we have in place are simply not set up to deal with that situation very well, and so it requires a lot of creative advocacy on the part of anyone working with people facing forced marriage. And then finally, a really important complication here that Casey spoke to already is the ongoing entanglement of immigration and criminal law. In many cases of forced marriage, where again, we're seeing that the perpetrators of the violence are close family members, often parents, maybe aunts or uncles, or close community members, there is often a complicated relationship between the person who is facing the forced marriage and the perpetrators of that forced marriage in that situation. And while what we see in our cases is that the person facing a forced marriage, of course, does not want that marriage to happen. They don't want to face the violence, but they also often don't want to see harmful consequences to people that they may still harbor some love for their parents, for their siblings, for their cousins, aunts, and uncles. And that makes it really complicated when we're talking about involving the criminal legal system and the immigration system, because while they may not want that marriage to occur, they may also fear the jailing or deportation of a family member. Can advance the slide. So when it comes to child marriage in the US, a couple folks have touched on this already, but there are just 16 states and Washington, D.C., as well as I would shout out 2 territories, American Samoa and the U.S. Virgin Islands have banned child marriage entirely. Doing this is simple when it comes to writing the law. You set the minimum marriage age at the age of majority. Generally speaking, that's 18, though there are a few places where it is higher, and you don't include exceptions. When we're writing the bills that do this, it's often just as simple as like scratching out the existing exceptions so that the minimum marriage age is 18 without exceptions. So the states and DC that have done this already are listed here on the slide. If the state that you live in is not pictured here, then child marriage remains legal in that state in some capacity. As of this year, I mentioned the states that have banned child marriage entirely. There are a total of 36 states that have taken some sort of action. So while the states pictured here are the ones that have gotten to our ultimate destination of banning child marriage entirely, there is more movement happening in states, and a lot of these campaigns involve slowly building power and preventing the child marriages that we can on our way to banning child marriage entirely. But many states are at least moving in the right direction, even if much more slowly than we would like to see. The bad news, of course, is the vast majority of states have not banned child marriage. This is still very much an ongoing campaign, and some of the states with the least protective and most dangerous laws have yet to take any action. There are still 4 states remaining that have no minimum marriage age at all, as well as 2 U.S. territories. There are still states that have pregnancy exception on the books that, in effect, award a marriage license to someone who is, in fact, the perpetrator of the rape of a child. And so there are still really urgent campaigns needed in a lot of states to prevent this harm. We can advance the slide. There are also criminal laws that deal specifically with forced marriage in a few jurisdictions. So 11 jurisdictions have criminal laws on the books that specifically talk about forced marriage. These are typically housed within sections of code that are dealing with issues of sex work or human trafficking. And so they may not apply cleanly to many forced marriage cases that don't necessarily have these components involved in them, but it's important to know that they're on the books. There are also 3 states that have criminal statutes on the books that relate specifically to the abduction of certain minors for the purpose of marriage. So again, these are very specifically written. They don't apply to every case, but it's important to know that they're on the books. One important thing to note again is that many people facing forced marriage may not want to involve the criminal legal system in their case because they fear consequences for family members who, while they recognize the harm that they are perpetrating, they may still hold affection for. Nevertheless, knowing that these laws are here can be useful, if nothing else, then as a point of negotiation. It can be powerful for a person to say, what you are doing is illegal. Here is the law. Here is the consequences you could face if you go forward and force me into this marriage. That can be an important negotiation point when working towards safety in these scenarios. Next slide, please. I want to highlight a couple of other approaches that different states have taken to addressing the issue of child marriage. While the only way to end child marriage is to ban it, to make it illegal to issue a marriage license to a minor, there are some other approaches that we've seen states taking, and that's really important for anyone who is working with people facing forced marriage. We know that not every case is going to be the same, and different people are going to want to pursue different means of preventing a forced marriage or seeking justice in that case. So one innovative approach that we've seen is Texas is now the only state that explicitly defines a forced child marriage as a type of child abuse in their code. This was done simultaneously with a 2017 law that limited marriage to legal adults there. And this has some really important implications. It clearly puts child marriage as a forced child marriage as a type of harm that falls within the mandate of family protective services there. So that's the Texas equivalent of child protective services in other states. And what that means is that any DFPS worker or any other adult is able to file for a protection order on behalf of a minor facing a forced marriage. And again, that is a really important option to have on the table as an advocate, particularly when we're working on a case where the person may not want to involve criminal consequences, but needs the legal system involved to issue an order of protection. Next slide. And then in Tennessee, we've also seen a recent reform. This one was, I believe, the following year in 2018, they became the first state to create a specific civil cause of action for survivors of forced marriage. So this is not child marriage specific. This is for anyone who was forced into marriage. They are able to pursue monetary damages. And this is great in that it is, again, providing a civil option without necessarily involving the criminal justice system. And it gives survivors a clear recognition that what was done to them is wrong, that it was harmful, and it has the opportunity to directly hold those their perpetrators accountable in a civil court. Next slide, please. Okay, and at this point, I'm going to transition back to Casey, who is our federal law expert, to give an overview of federal laws addressing the issue of forced child marriage.
Thank you, Alex. And one other note I wanted to make about this feeling of reticence that some survivors have about engaging with the criminal legal system. I think the entanglement of immigration law and the criminal legal system is a really important one to name. But as you were talking, I was also reminded of Donna's story and also reminded of Heather's story that Anjali shared. And Heather's outcome, I want to say, is incredibly rare and unique. In the most common scenarios that we see, when survivors reach out to the criminal justice, system for help, they call 911. Unfortunately, oftentimes those systems are still failing survivors. Survivors, we hear all the time in the news and elsewhere, are often still not believed. And when you think about a child trying to tell a police officer what's happening to them inside of their home, the outcomes that we see are far too often that survivors continue to be disbelieved, and the systems that are supposed to protect women and girls, unfortunately, all too often fail them. I will say, when we are doing trainings, particularly for law enforcement and others involved with the criminal legal system, we bring Heather's story to the forefront to share how a local sheriff who actually knew every member of that family, including the perpetrating father, put Heather at the center of his investigation, believed Heather, believed her mother, pursued charges, and was successful. But every time we present that, there is real surprise and shock in the room. We would obviously love for every survivor to have a sheriff like that in their town. Unfortunately, we are not there yet as a nation. And I think that is another really important piece to acknowledge when working with survivors, meeting them where they're at, providing services, and acknowledging that not everyone is going to feel comfortable reaching out to law enforcement because of just how often law enforcement disregards what women and girls are saying and what they're asking for. So to shift back into sort of the current state of play of federal law. And it feels a little silly to be talking about this in the middle of a government shutdown and in a world in which Congress is fairly dysfunctional. But I think it's important to know what is the current state of play and what are the gaps and what are advocates working towards, despite all of the challenges that are specific to this issue, but also much broader than this issue. And so I'll start with the progress that was made. So already mentioned by Maniza earlier in the presentation, we were really thrilled that in 2022, when the Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized, Tahirih, along with our partners in the movement to end violence against women, were able to repeal the marriage defense to statutory rape on the federal level. It's really important to acknowledge that this is only when someone is being charged with the federal crime of statutory rape, which typically must involve cross-border dynamics. There are still states, including Maryland as of a couple of years ago, who still have marriage defenses to statutory rape on the books. And that is an ongoing campaign that many state-based domestic violence and sexual assault coalitions are working hard on. But the sad truth is, this will go a long way to sending the message that we should not have marriage defenses to statutory rape, but it did not undo the laws on the state level that still exist, which are extremely problematic. That Violence Against Women Act reauthorization also required a 50-state study and report on contradictions in state laws on marriage age and age of consent. That report is available. However, we have already spotted errors. This is a complex area of research and investigation, and unfortunately, Anjali was not the one doing the researching, and so we continue to liaise with with DOJ to try and get those errors fixed. But the report broadly is an important advocacy tool because when a report comes from inside of the federal government, it tends to be taken more seriously when you're talking to members of Congress, when you're doing administrative advocacy to say, it's not just us as nonprofits who are naming this as a problem, you yourselves have reported on the issue, and it is problematic. And then we also did work with USCIS to institute sub-regulatory guidance, which is basically, it's not statutory, it's not the law, but it's instructions for those at US Citizenship and Immigration Services who are adjudicating, right? So deciding whether or not a spousal visa or a fiance visa will be approved. They have guidance on, well, if there's a child involved, you should be looking at the state law about whether or not that marriage would be legal where these two folks are intending to live. And if there's a broad age gap, that's a red flag, and you should be interviewing those spouses to ensure that we do not have a forced child marriage scenario. That sub-regulatory guidance is important, but it's imperfect, and there's more that we need to do. One of the biggest gaps, of course, is that there is no minimum age set by statute for someone in the United States to be the sponsor or the petitioner of a visa for a spouse or fiance. And at Tahirih, we have certainly worked with individuals under the age of 18 who are being pressured or forced to marry someone and then fill out immigration paperwork on their behalf to bring them to live as quote unquote spouse, even when they do not want to. There is one survivor in particular that has advocated for changes in state laws that speaks of feeling like at the age of 15, she was just a visa. The overwhelming majority of these cases, though, involve much older US citizens petitioning for very young foreign-born brides and spouses. In many of these cases, we see dynamics of human trafficking under the guise of marriage. And right now, again, there is no limit on the age of an individual that can be brought over as a spouse or fiance through the marriage-based visa system right now. Obviously, that is a huge gap in our laws that is putting both US girls at risk and girls around the world at risk. So to get back to that point that Maniza was making is that we are not exceptional when it comes to this issue. And the global movement is interconnected, and the United States really needs to step up as a leader because our laws actually put girls around the world at risk, not just our own citizens. There is also no prohibition on child marriage taking place on federal land. So we think about national parks, we think about Smithsonian buildings. These are places where marriages happen and child marriage is legally happening in those spaces. There has also been no incentive, no push for the states to make progress. And this can be a powerful tool. It's like we talk about carrots and sticks. One carrot that the federal government has, which is incredibly powerful, is providing support to states to make change. A lot of times, the excuse that states make is that we just don't have the money for this. We just don't have the bandwidth to pay attention to this. And I think about a world in which there was more momentum and more incentive and more support for states to make this change. It could mean that advocates like Donna have support from the federal government to be working towards banning child marriage in Kentucky. And it is places like Kentucky, like Georgia. I think about Mississippi, Alabama, places where the domestic violence coalitions and the sexual assault coalitions struggle the most and fight the hardest to make change, even in ways that those of us who live in Washington, D.C. or New York or California really can't imagine. And those states cannot be left behind and often need extra help coming from the federal government. And as ever, there are model statutes in lots of areas of law that come from the Department of Justice at the federal level that allow states to say, we really need to fix XYZ area of our statute. Instead of reinventing the wheel here, I wonder if, someone has thought about how to do this best. And typically they'll go and they'll find model statute promulgated by the Department of Justice. And that's a helpful way to move this movement along, which would be for the Department of Justice to provide model statute, which, as Alex alluded to earlier, is a very simple few line of text, which just says marriage is limited to those 18 or older, if that is the age of majority in your state. There's a couple of states where the age of majority is higher, and so they would need to sort of make sure that there's parity there. But just to bring this all back home on the impact, this issue of children being forced into marriage via the marriage-based visa system is not a small one. We do have data. Maniza mentioned it earlier. Close to 9,000 marriage-based visas involving at least one minor were approved between 2007 and 2017. Again, when we dissected this data, it was older adult men petitioning for younger minor girls. In the majority of cases, again, it was US citizens bringing incredibly vulnerable foreign-born children to the United States to live as their fiancés and spouses. We could do an entire hour on how dangerous that is for a young girl to come to the United States, not speaking the language, not having family, community, not knowing her rights. In that instance, Tahirih has worked on the mail order bride industry and trying to regulate that through the International Marriage Broker Regulation Act back in 2013. We're going to leave it here for today, but I think everyone can appreciate just how vulnerable a girl in that situation would be. And we can go to the next slide. So the good news is, for the first time in US history, in the last Congress, we did see a bill introduced on the federal level to prevent child marriage in the marriage-based visa system and to incentivize states to take action. This was championed by Senator Durbin, Senator Schatz, and Senator Gillibrand. It would set minimum ages for petitioners and beneficiaries of spouse and fiancé visas. It would ban child marriage from happening on government land and property. It would do an impact study, which is different than the study on the disconnect between consent laws and marriage laws, but something more focused on the prevalence of child marriage within the marriage-based visa program, because the data we have, as ever, is old. All of the data we have continues to age the farther away we get from it. And so updated study and ongoing reporting on how many children are being married and approved for visas through that program. And on the next slide, we'll talk about a few other pieces of this bill. It would be setting up a national commission. These are important in terms of, again, bringing national attention to the issue, ensuring that the federal government takes it seriously and that there is awareness across departments. It really is critical for making change, even though it can sometimes feel slow and incremental. It's part of a larger whole. I already spoke to the necessity for incentives for states, especially states with limited resources where nonprofits and coalitions are doing as much as they can on shoestring budgets to try and make change. This can make a huge difference in conjunction with the state task force grants, and again, a model state statute. So this is really a comprehensive bill to do two things at once: address the child marriage through the immigration system problem and incentivize states to ban child marriage on US soil. So really attacking the issue from both root causes and both pathways so that we cut it off in both instances, but also do not scapegoat one community or another in our efforts to prevent child marriage, especially in today's climate. And we can go to the next slide, which I think has me passing it back off to you, Maniza, and just want to say so much thanks to you and Population Institute for the incredible report. Really nuanced and thoughtful analysis and language there that we don't often see, and for holding this space and inviting us all to be here together today to talk about this issue. I really appreciate it.
Oh no, thank you so much for for both you and Alex for walking us through the very complex patchwork of laws that we have and the different avenues that we have to tackle in the legal system when it comes to child marriage. I always learn a lot every time I hear either of you speak, honestly. So I really appreciate you both for taking the time to be here. And I do want to give a chance to our audience to interact with our speakers today to ask about their experiences, their challenges, and the solutions that they believe can make a difference. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat if any come up. But while I still have you, Casey and Alex, on the microphone. I think I'll start with you all. And just, I think a question that comes up a lot is what barriers do you face in aligning federal immigration laws and state marriage laws? And like, what kind of barriers do you come across when trying to enact reform?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, immigration law is incredibly complicated. Um, we all know that because multiple efforts at comprehensive immigration reform have failed. Um, it is a broken system. So trying to reform it in these sort of scalpel-like ways to better protect women and girls is challenging. But this one for us feels like a no-brainer. And I think there is potential for pretty strong bipartisan support on this particular piece of the pie. Understanding that a lot of these cases look like human trafficking, feel like human trafficking to the survivors experiencing it. And I think child marriage has experienced bipartisan support on the state level, and that legislation to focus specifically on this area of immigration law, we believe strongly can engender the same kind of bipartisan support. That said, in a climate where almost every other avenue to immigration is being shut, where immigrant communities themselves are feeling vilified and scapegoated, and we're seeing specifically in the asylum system, it's becoming increasingly hard for survivors specifically. Gender-based claims of asylum. Asylum claims rooted in the experience of systemic gender-based violence and domestic violence are under attack from the Attorney General and the Board of Immigration Appeals. And so when we are talking about closing an immigration pathway in an effort to protect immigrant girls from harm, it can feel like shutting a door to immigration on advocates who work on immigration but do not work on violence against women issues. And so we are threading a very careful needle to educate both movements around what does it look like for an immigration system to center the needs of women and girls. Tahirih luckily has the privilege of working in both areas right now. So leading on the Child Marriage Prevention Act, which would curtail immigration in an effort to protect girls from exploitation, while also fighting to name gender as a sixth ground of asylum, which I know is a very technical way of talking about it, but what it would mean is that the same protection that is offered to political dissidents, to religious minorities, is offered to women who are experiencing systemic and unrestrained gender-based violence in their countries of origin, which is not true right now. Women experiencing gender-based violence have the hardest uphill battle in our immigration system when it comes to themselves seeking protection. Oddly enough, at the same time, it's as easy as filling out paperwork to exploit a child through the immigration system. So we're trying to flip that script. It should be impossible to bring a child bride to the United States, and it should be much easier for a survivor of gender-based asylum to seek protection from persecution in this country. So again, this could be a very long conversation, but it's the importance of having those two understandings and those two conversations running at the same time could not be more critical than in this moment. And I think I'd love to hand it over to Donna if you would like to talk about any of the challenges you've experienced on the state level that either mirror what I've already talked about or are hyper specific to Kentucky, which I know everybody would say their state's a special case, but I think Kentucky has proven itself to be one on multiple fronts, this one included.
Thank you, Casey. Yes, absolutely. Kentucky is quite the special place in this situation. And unfortunately, there's a lot of beautiful things about Kentucky, but unfortunately, this is not a topic that is. I think one of the main challenges that I've run into during my historical advocacy and even in current conversations around this upcoming General Assembly, going back to the table and achieving an age 18 bright line is that they minimize the number of cases that are happening. And so, what I hear from people is, well, with the change in law back in 2018, you've reduced this by like 97%. There's always going to be some, right? And what I would say to that is that instead of looking at this as numbers, the lives behind the data is what we should be putting our focus on. Because just one person, just one child being subjected to being groomed, being abused, being entrapped essentially, that is a life that has potential to not be really fulfilled. And that passes along to intergenerational traumas as well. One of the things that I think is very shocking for people that initially they don't believe until I'm able to actually show them the data in black and white is how prevalent child marriage is from an intergenerational capacity. My mother had just completed the 8th grade when she was married off. And when she married my dad, she became a stepmom to 2 young boys. He was old enough that he had already been married before. He had 2 small boys, and he had already served in the Korean War. So at the time she married him, she became responsible for those kids, 13 years of age. That type of trauma, that type of limited educational experience perpetuates these cycles. And getting people to really see that interconnectivity is very challenging a lot of times. And that's why it's so important for survivors to be able to come forward and share their experiences, because we have to humanize the issue. We have to be able to say, let me tell you how this happened in my family. Let me tell you how that trickled into my own life. Let me tell you the challenges that I have experienced and the hurdles that I continue to face as well. Now, all of that to say, I'm not without hope. I will continue to fight until my very last breath on this planet in this lifetime. Again, going back to what I said earlier, my goal in that fight is to become the last generation of this fight, because we have to be able to break these cycles. Humans in general deserve to live a life free from having to recover from atrocities that the system itself could help prevent.
That's exactly right, Donna. And I think what you are experiencing in Kentucky is very similar to some of the rhetoric we heard in Virginia, which was, back in 2016, 2017, we made progress, and now the numbers are very small. And what I was able to convey in my testimony is that was never our goal. Just a handful of children married in the state of Virginia was never our goal. Our
Right.
goal was 0. And we're close, but not there yet. And we were able to achieve that final step the second time we revisited. And I think you have a powerful case in Kentucky, given how much you're able to prove now that that's not a trustworthy system with the protocols that we put in place. And so the only solution is a full ban. And that was always the goal, because as you say, like, one child married is too many. And so what we don't need as a movement is to get mired in like, how many is an acceptable number of child brides? Because the answer is always 0. It might take incremental steps, but that is ultimately the goal. And I do believe with your efforts and the efforts of folks who are on this call, it will happen in your generation. And this will be like one torch we do not have to pass on to the next generation.
Exactly. Thank you, Casey.
Oh, thank you both. I think that's like the message to hone in on when talking about child marriage in the United States is that no child marriage is acceptable. And thank you both for speaking a little bit about the barriers that you face when advocating for this issue. I hate to cut off the Q&A because I feel like we could keep going forever, but we are nearing 11, and I want Casey and Alex to have a chance to just talk about a little bit about how folks on this call might be able to get involved, because I think that's a natural question that comes up when hearing about issues that are so tough to hear about, and you just want to do something about it. So we can transition into that. And if folks still have questions in the audience, I think everyone's contact information is provided here, so feel free to reach out. Melina, you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, and exactly. And if you want to advance the slide to the one with me and Alex's, I can share a little bit about this, but again, I'm going to use my speaker's privilege to pass it to Donna, because there is a very specific campaign to keep an eye on and that you can get involved with, that Tahirih is playing a minimal role in. And after being in space with Donna today, I was like, you don't need anybody. You'll be fine completely on your own, but we are happy to provide any and all support as that campaign moves forward. But Donna, I'd love for you to talk about a very specific state-based campaign to look for next year, and then Alex and I can sort of talk about what else might be happening.
Sure. Thank you so much, Casey. And certainly don't minimize your all's efforts. You all have been incredible supporters and tremendous leaders in this space. And truly, I couldn't do it without you. So in Kentucky, as I mentioned during my presentation, I have founded the Rise Kentucky Coalition. Rise is meaningful. It stands for Reclaim Innocence, Stop Exploitation, which I think is the foundation of what we are all here to do. So, to become a member of the Rise Kentucky Coalition, you can just go to my website, which is trauma2purpose.com, and click on where it talks about the Rise Kentucky Coalition. It'll give you information on our efforts. And if you sign up, you will be on our email distribution. So as we approach session and we have opportunities to hold our rallies, to send letters to our legislators, to sign up for speaking opportunities, connect survivors with opportunities to advocate, you all will be in the know about that. So please feel free to reach out to me today. And again, thank you so much to Tahirih and the Population Institute. Definitely plug into Tahirih and find out how you can support their efforts across the country as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Donna. And I have no doubt that this will be a successful campaign in Kentucky this year. I know you've already got legislative champions eager to introduce the bill to ban child marriage entirely, and an incredible state-based coalition of folks who know Kentucky well, and will be standing alongside you. So that is very exciting. I will just share that we continue to work on reintroduction of the Child Marriage Prevention Act. As those who have done federal legislating before probably know, it is a very long road. Oftentimes, bills get reintroduced multiple Congresses before they are finally voted on and passed. And that is the kind of work that Tahirih and many of the folks we align with are very used to. So we are working right now to get reintroduction to happen. As you might be aware, not all of Congress is working right now, only half of it. Luckily for us, our bill champions are in the Senate, and the Senate is still in session. They are working on the Hill, and so we are in conversation with them about timeline for reintroduction. And when that happens, we will obviously be celebrating that and be giving folks the opportunity to contact their members of Congress to say, you should co-sponsor this legislation if you haven't already. So that will be one opportunity to keep an eye out for. And the one other thing that we haven't yet mentioned, which is another sort of creative avenue that I cannot take credit for, but has existed in the UK for a very long time, which is a forced marriage prevention order, specific protection order against forced marriage that applies to children and adults. There is a very low barrier to entry for the forced marriage prevention order in the UK, and we are exploring an opportunity in a state to do something similar. We have consistently encouraged states to expand and better articulate their protection order statutes. Sometimes they're known as restraining order statutes, so that it encompasses the types of behavior and by whom that a forced marriage survivor might be facing. But we are excited to be exploring right now the opportunity to do a standalone prevention order in a state. And so when and if that gets introduced, whether it's this session or the next, we will definitely be letting this community know too, because it is an exciting new path. Because as you stated from the beginning, it's about community change, it's about civil tools. It can be about the criminal justice system operating in a way that is survivor-centered, but there are multiple pathways to ending this form of abuse, and it's all needed. And Tahirih is small but mighty and trying to do a lot with a little. But we're excited to be exploring that path, because the child marriage sort of campaign to ban it on the state level this year saw its most productive year, with the number of states banning child marriage in 2025. The momentum is there, it's growing, it's very exciting. So we're staying in that space and also finding opportunity to think about what else have survivors told us they need? What more can we be thinking about? So with that, I know we're at time and I'll hand it back to you, Maniza, again, with just like deep gratitude for all the work that you and the Population Institute are doing.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for sharing. Just a big thank you to Tahirih for helping us out today on the webinar and Casey's contributions to Behind Closed Doors too. Thank you so much to our speakers for the powerful contributions today. Casey, thank you for ending on more of a positive note on the progress that's been happening. I know a lot of the conversation feels doom and gloom, but there has been a ton of progress and it's really exciting to see and especially exciting to hear from all these folks today that are working on the issue. Donna, we're deeply grateful for your courage and sharing your story with us. Your voice is a reminder of the human side of the statistics and the resilience and strength that really drives the movement. Anjali, thank you for shining a light on the realities and complexities of child marriage through reporting and also sharing your personal story. It helps us understand not just what is happening, but why and what needs to change. And it's spurred a lot of advocacy in the field. And of course, Casey and Alex, thanks for everything you do related to child marriage and forced marriage and helping to ground this conversation in evidence and solutions, because these insights that you all have are really pathways to creating real and lasting change and coming at it with like immigration law, child marriage law, forced marriage law, all those things. I think a huge part of what we learned today is that it's not just about legal reform, but there are so many different avenues of change. Us being in conversation today and all of our participants and audience is a form of reform in itself. Talking about the problem, talking about things like bodily autonomy, sexual health, um, gender discriminations all contributes to ending child marriage. And I know we're over time, so I'll let everybody go, but thank you all so much for joining, and hope to see you all stay connected.
Thank you so much, Maniza. And thank you, Anjali and Donna. It's great to see you.
Thank you all.